Hi, I'm Dr. Jeff Kieliszewski. Welcome to my YouTube channel on forensic psychology. Today I'm going to talk about the fascinating technique that's sometimes used by forensic psychologists. It's called psychological autopsy. There are a few different definitions of psychological autopsy, but I think the best way to define it is psychological autopsy is a systematic procedure or process that can be used by forensic psychologists to try to understand a person's mental state prior to and leading up to their death, and potentially be able to explain behaviors that occurred prior to their death. Now, the history of psychological autopsy goes back to the late 1950s, when some of the beginning research on suicidality and prevention of suicide began to come out. Then and now, psychological autopsy is utilized to often try to make a determination if someone actually intended to end their own life. So, for example, in accidental deaths, accidental overdose, car accidents. Originally, the use of psychological autopsy was really focused on trying to help understand people's state of mind prior to suicide in order to assist in more effective suicide prevention programming. Now, in recent times, psychological autopsy has been utilized frequently in medical malpractice claims and also civil lawsuits that are alleging institutional neglect. Now, I've also seen psychological autopsy utilized a few times in high-profile criminal cases. So, for example, in mass shooting cases, if lawsuits get involved, sometimes the attorneys involved will try to get a psychological autopsy to understand the alleged perpetrator's frame of mind prior to the crime and what could have motivated him or her to carry out the crime. So I've been hired a few times to conduct psychological autopsies. One case in particular that I'm thinking about, I was hired in a medical malpractice lawsuit that involved quite egregious neglect and untreated injury in a long-term care facility. In that case, my job was to help the jury understand the decedent's state of mind leading up to her death, her likely pain and suffering that was occurring, and also the idea of her potential loss of will to live as contributing to her death. This case also brought in the whole research on the concept of will to live, which is a fascinating body of research. Mostly you'll find in the hospice literature, but that's a different video, I guess. In that case, another thing that I really remember is the defense attorney for the insurance company really grilled me on the stand when I testified about how psychological autopsy is junk science. So, how does a forensic psychologist conduct a psychological autopsy? Well, it's all about trying to understand the person's state of mind leading up to a tragedy. Now, it's not uncommon for forensic psychologists to be tasked with understanding a person's state of mind in the past, not present. So, for example, a hallmark of insanity evaluations is trying to understand a person's state of mind prior to, during, and after the alleged crime. Now, in an insanity examination, you get the luxury of you can actually talk to the defendant and do an examination of the defendant. In psychological autopsy, obviously the person that you're trying to examine and understand their state of mind has died. So, in cases of psychological autopsy, the forensic psychologist really needs to rely on collateral information and collateral data. This would be things like medical records, police reports, witness interviews. In the case I was involved with, I interviewed family members who had contact with the deceased just prior to her death. Sometimes photos of the person prior to the death. In one case I was involved with, I had to listen to phone messages that they left on an answering machine. This is some years back. One very interesting case that I was involved with a few years ago was when I was contacted by an award-winning investigative journalist named Ken Fortenberry. Ken was writing a book. The title of the book was Flight 7 is Missing, The Search for My Father's Killer. This came out in 2020. So Ken was writing a book about a plane crash of Pan Am Flight 7 in 1957. The plane was en route from San Francisco to Hawaii, and it was later determined that it exploded in midair and killed everyone on board. And sort of the wild part of this story is that Ken's own father was actually the co-pilot on that doomed flight. So in that case, the FBI and a private investigator hired by an insurance company investigated two individuals, a guy named William Payne and a guy named Gene Crosswaith. There were speculations that one of these men may have sabotaged the plane, causing it to crash and kill everyone on board. So how did I conduct the psychological autopsies in that case? And we're talking about a case 60 years old. Well, Ken was able to obtain and examine extensive records pertaining to the FBI investigation and the investigation by the private investigator. He also interviewed several people who knew Payne and Crosswaith well. So he was able to develop this really, really impressive biopsychosocial history on both men. So in that case, I relied on all the evidence that Ken collected and amassed over decades of his research to come up with some conclusions that if either one of these men actually sabotaged the plane, who it likely was. By the way, Ken's book is amazing. I think I left a copy of it. It's in my office at home, not here. But anyway, if you're interested in investigative journalism, true crime, or aviation history, you got to get his book. I'll post a description or a link to the book in the description below. Thanks for tuning in. If you're interested in forensic psychology or true crime, please subscribe to the channel. Also pass it along to others who may have a similar interest. You can also find me on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And most recently, I got on TikTok as well. Thanks for tuning in.